Years ago, we started Fairwinds first and foremost as a services company.
For us, that means humans helping humans be great at very difficult things. Since then, we've seen a massive shift in DevOps culture and tooling. We want to prepare you for the future of cloud infrastructure and help save you from the many mistakes that we've made along the way. We don't just want to do Kubernetes for you, we want to help you do it for yourself. We'll do that here on this podcast and a whole lot more. In upcoming episodes, we'll talk Kubernetes, leadership, and DevOps culture in general in ways that we hope will help you and your company successfully navigate the cloud. This is Environmentally Friendly, and I'm your host, Kendall Miller. Welcome. We're here today with Sarah Zelechoski, our VP of Engineering at Fairwinds, and today we're going to be talking about Kubernetes and when organizations adopt it and where organizations go with it, etc. So let's dive right in. I mean, first of all, thanks for being here.
Yeah.
So tell me just a little bit about, what kinds of companies are thinking about adopting Kubernetes?
All of them.
All of them. So John's Tire Shop, are they adopting Kubernetes?
I've certainly talked to a tire shop.
You
so
have?
Yes.
Okay.
They may not have been ready, but I think the interesting thing is that all organizations of all different sizes are thinking about it right now, right?
They need to be running something on the internet, and that's about the only thing? Or do they not even need that?
Do they not even need Kubernetes?
Do they need to be running something on the internet to
Yes.
want Kubernetes?
I think that's the key,
Okay.
right? There are companies who aren't even really mature in the cloud yet who are thinking about Kubernetes. I think there's kind of this phenomenon that if you're not there yet, you might as well start with whatever's new and hot. So there are a lot of young companies who are jumping right in. I think there's a lot of learning that needs to be done about your service and application running in the cloud at the same time, which is sometimes challenging. But even more mature companies who've been in the cloud for a while are adopting Kubernetes. There's a lot of promise in it, right? To change the way that you work, to change your flexibility and your scalability for workloads. So I think everyone's seeing potential in it.
Okay. And at what point in a company's journey are they even looking at this as a piece of technology? Yeah, sure, maybe everybody wants it or everybody's looking into it or everybody's thinking about it, but when do companies actually start thinking about jumping in? And is it when they're 5 employees or 500 employees? Is it when they're spending $5,000 a year or $5 million a year? What are the sort of the trigger points that get people interested in moving this direction?
That's a great question. I think one of the things might be just kind of how often you have to deliver.
Sure.
Right? If you have to deliver multiple times a month, multiple times a week, you have to be more flexible than the old style of deployment, where you've got static instances with no containers and things like that, and your whole organization needs to kind of be on board with it. And so I think you have to have a pretty mature engineering organization, which means developers who know what they're doing, potentially build and deploy engineers, and then potentially operations and infrastructure engineers.
Does anybody actually need to be deploying multiple times a week? And I play a little bit devil's advocate, but couldn't you in theory deploy once a month and keep up or not?
You could. I think these days everybody expects everything to be on all the time.
Yep.
And they expect bugs to be fixed almost immediately. So it becomes much more a problem of people's expectations, and customer expectations, right? Now there's some certain verticals, like e-commerce verticals, where you have to be delivering every day because there's new products, there's new marketing initiatives, whatever there is.
Sure.
And so I think they have a really high need. But even what you would consider classically slower industries like healthcare and things like that are now trying to ship more often, because then they can kind of tune their performance of their application and make sure that the user are having a better experience.
Sure. Well, so it's not necessarily just about staying ahead of your competitors and being able to iterate all the time. There's things to consider hey, we found a bug, and if we were only shipping once a month, we gotta wait a month to patch that bug,
right.
Or else we have to change our whole process to patch that one thing.
And if you think the audience these days are just really impatient. Everything is on demand, right?
Yep.
Netflix on demand. You can order groceries and have them delivered same day. So, everybody just expects things to happen immediately. And so
Sure.
if you're having a bad experience, you're going to leave. You're not going to be a customer anymore. But if you can have things fixed in a reasonable schedule, then, you'll stick around. So I think that's part of the expectations as well.
Yeah, there's an expectation of the ability to iterate at this point. That's actually interesting. So last time we were recording, our guest said that there are some customers or some companies that end up behind, and there starts to be shame. Hey, we're so far behind, we're actually embarrassed of where we're at, and we can't even come ask for help because we're so far behind. It's embarrassing to tell you what we have going on. Did you ever run into that?
All the time. I think everybody's kind of making it up as they go. And we're all, like I said, humans doing the best that we can, right?
Yeah.
There is some shame, though. I think that has a lot to do with the way that we communicate these days. If you are in a tech community that's moving fast, we're constantly pushing new products, new ideas, new ways of doing things.
Yep.
And people feel the need to keep up and stay relevant. And unfortunately, that leaves you kind of always doing things quickly and leaving them behind, such that you're not really digging in and getting good at the fundamentals, right? So I think you're right. Like, there's this kind of fear of missing out if you focus on something, which is unfortunate.
I mean, what percentage of all the companies out there, like just spitballing, I know you don't know, you're not a research company last I checked, but what percentage of all the companies out there actually have a, pretty cutting edge stack that can, really work the way people talk about it in books?
Very, very few.
Yeah.
It must be top 5%.
Right. So being ashamed that you're behind is a little bit like, comparing yourself to the models we have in magazines, where I tend to fall short. But okay, that's interesting. Talk a little bit about when companies are making this change, what are some of the first things that they bump up against? Like what is we've decided as an organization we want to adopt Kubernetes, wherever they are in that. What are the kinds of decisions they're going to make at first? How are they going to fail or succeed and then iterate on that? Like, what does the typical pattern look like?
I would say the first step in general is learning. What I see most often is that companies will have one engineer who is tapped into the community, who understands the options, and who can do some sort of proof of concept. What generally happens is they get a little bit of buy-in from internal, stakeholders. They say, these are the improvements we're going to get out of Kubernetes. This is the value, and they can sometimes sell just kind of a little bit of R&D and some proof of concept. And so companies will generally start there.
Yep.
And there's a lot of problematic behavior, unfortunately, with that step. First of all, like the cloud native landscape is just huge.
Yeah.
There's so many competitors in the field for every little aspect of your infrastructure. And so, being able to choose from all the different open source packages or all the different vendors is just a full-time job.
Yep.
And depending on who's doing your proof of concept, you're going to get a flavored opinion, right? So it may not be best practices. You'll be getting whatever that one engineer thought was best.
Where are they even going for this information, right? Like, probably they're not going to a training with, people who really know things inside and out. They read an article on Hacker News once that said, hey, look, I managed to run, Docker on my Docker, and you can too, right? So where are people even getting information? Are there good sources out there?
There are certainly good sources. I think you have to kind of be tapped into what are the sources that are actually valuable for your particular problem set, and then who's trustworthy, who's credible, who's going to be here today and gone tomorrow, who's going to be here in the long run, right? It's interesting. I ask every person that I interview this question, like, where do you get your news and information, right?
Yep.
And I think the big ones are conferences, trainings, Twitter, GitHub, sometimes podcasts, sometimes newsletters, that type of thing. And then a lot of it is learning from your peers, somebody who knows, right? And so I think the Slack communities are really big as well.
Well, I think there's got to be a tension between engineers' desires to solve complex problems or really interesting problems, and then the companies need to just solve the problem, right? And the two aren't always compatible with each other. So how does somebody decide? Like you said, it depends on what your problem space is, or what is the specific problem you have to solve. And I imagine, is it different for everyone, basically, or is there parts of it that are the same for everyone?
It depends. I think, like I said, there's some themes in the verticals. depending on what your workloads look like. Some, customers who do things job-based, who have to run a lot of little jobs, they have sort of similar problems that they have to solve. Then there's companies that are in kind of high security, high trust environments that have similar security problems, right? So there's themes.
Yeah.
But when it comes down to it, everybody's workloads are so unique, and it's not only because you're solving a different, unique problem, but you're also solving it with a different, unique organization, right? And so it really depends on who your developers are, how they were trained, how they're managed, how you're delivering, right? There's just so much there. There are best practices, I think, that you can follow, that you can standardize to give people a good base. But there's a lot of legwork that you have to do on top to make sure that it's good for you.
I mean, you're talking a little bit about sort of how the organizational structure of every company affects their ability to adopt these things. I mean, talk a little bit more about that.
Sure.
Wait, I want to put in some jargon here. Let's double click on that.
My favorite.
Go a little bit deeper. Yeah, I mean,
Sure.
that's if it's organizational messiness, I have to use organizational jargon.
Yeah, sure.
Go ahead.
There's so many things that can go wrong with own org, right? On one end of the spectrum, you've got these really small startups who are jumping in with both feet, and they have a very small team, and often the founders are making technical decisions, which is interesting. Right?
Sometimes that works out.
Sometimes that works out.
Full stop.
They've got maybe one engineer, right? And maybe they don't even have their business problem really solved yet.
Yeah.
And so they've got a lot of good agility. They can change things really quickly, they can move really fast, but they're not going to have stability up front, right? So they're probably going to be struggling with their customer base in the beginning, just kind of getting the reputation of being stable and being able to deliver. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got these giant enterprises who just take so much longer to adopt things, right? Every team is different, every business unit is different. If you've got 15 people who share the same decision, it becomes very hard to move fast or move quickly, and it becomes very hard to decide on standards. So I think there's just problems everywhere.
Well, I mean, that's interesting. The number of organizations that I know that have a procurement process, right? Like, oh, well, we want to adopt Kubernetes, but that means we need to, put it through our security team. We need to put it through our infrastructure team. We need to, 17 people and 2 years later, we can have evaluated that, oh, this wasn't the right solution, or whatever. And the struggle that those companies are going to have as this technology moves faster and faster and faster.
And that's what I was going to say, is that that's fine. And I think it's good that they are taking the time to do acceptance. But unfortunately, what will happen is the end product will already be 2 years old.
Yeah. They'll approve something that's no longer related.
And then they have to rebuild it all over again, right?
Yeah.
There's not a really good way to bring it up to speed.
So then talk a little bit about, a couple years ago, there was, sort of the whole world watching. Is it containers are going to be a thing? What's going to orchestrate them? Is it Docker Swarm? Is it Mesosphere? Is it Nomad? Is it Kubernetes? And I think, there's sort of been, there may be niche places for some of these other pieces, but Kubernetes has just kind of blown past the rest of the crowd. Maybe like a little bit of why is that, and are there still use cases for some of these other things, do you think? Or has there just been so much community adoption of the one that they're going to be left in the dust?
I think some of the other projects are already being left in the dust. The one thing that Kubernetes has going for it is that democratization of information and work, right? Just thousands and thousands of brilliant brains working on the same problem. And there are some challenges there, and there's some splay, but overall I think that the momentum is really powerful for Kubernetes. And it gives you the ability to grow in Kubernetes knowledge, whereas some of the other projects that are more specialized may be better for adoption and stability in the beginning because they're very regimented, they're very well understood, they have patterns, right? So it's not such a free-for-all. But I think it's harder, that silo of knowledge is harder. It's going to be very much harder to hire somebody who has, OpenShift knowledge or Mesosphere's knowledge. But you can pick somebody up, who knows Terraform and a couple cloud providers, and they can learn Kubernetes because the information is just available.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and then is there, and I'm going somewhere with this.
Sure.
But if you talk to a company and you say, hey, you should be running Kubernetes, is there and also, like, are there 3 or 4 default other pieces of technology, or not necessarily?
You may be talking to the wrong person. I haven't been technical in a couple of years.
Well, I mean, I think that like my assumption is that there's not really like there's a couple of other things that plug in, but I'm curious your thought. Like, I feel like Kubernetes has become this de facto standard, and yeah, there's a million things you can pile on, but there's also a million options for all those other things where Kubernetes has really dominated this one key piece that everything's building on, and it's not, you know, there are a million CI tools, there are a million network overlays, there's a million, a strong word, but there's options for all of these different things where, you know, each has sort of their pros and cons, but Kubernetes has really won this battle this is the solution.
I would agree. I would say the biggest argument that I hear from folks who haven't adopted Kubernetes and have no interest in it is just that there's too much complexity there, and there are some other services, container orchestration services, that are just easy.
Yeah.
Right? If you talk to a customer who's been in AWS for a really long time, they'll often say, you know, ECS was just easy because it was familiar, right? The vocab was familiar, and so for them, they don't need to adopt the complexity. They can just kind of move to something else. I think that's really the argument for Kubernetes. Like I said, the learning curve is huge.
Yeah.
It's possible, but it's huge. And so if you don't need the complexity, or if you're afraid of the complexity, or your organization can't support the complexity, then, you know, why do it?
But is it actually complex, or is it complex because nobody knows it yet? Like, I mean, you know, the same way that, like, is Linux actually complex, or is it just really different than Windows? And everybody learns Linux. Well, I don't know. I mean,
I should do like the Office look to the camera.
Yeah.
No, it is complex, and I think it's because it tries to reach across a spectrum from infrastructure all the way up to app delivery.
Yep.
So it's covering so many different bases. So yes, totally complex. All along the way, you have to be making decisions. If you've got all of the other problems solved, how do you deliver what your networking looks like, whatever, and you only want to focus on container orchestration, maybe not so complex, right? But I think people are trying to solve all the problems with Kubernetes.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes if you have a big enough burner, you can boil the ocean.
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
Totally.
as the old proverb says. Okay, well then let me ask you this. So company goes out there and decides Kubernetes is the solution. We definitely want this. We know there's complexity. We know there's a million things where we don't know. We've hired 5 very qualified people. They're going to come in and understand our infrastructure and then help us, you know, move towards Kubernetes. And in 6 months, we're going to have a production environment or whatever, our first production environment. What kinds of mistakes are people going to make when they first adopt this? And, you know, these are people who know it, and these are people who've looked at it, and these are, you know, like, what kinds of common mistakes come up for companies?
Yeah, I mean, operational experience can't be replaced with learning knowledge, right? You can read the entire manual and all of the configuration options, but unless you run your workload in production and see your customer response or have a really good test suite, I don't think you're going to know what the problems you're going to hit until you get there, right? And so one of the main problems that I see companies running into is that often that proof of concept stage that we talked about, they'll throw their easiest workload at it.
Yep.
And it's for a lot of different reasons. You know, it's maybe the least complex, so the engineers can learn Kubernetes as they go. Maybe it doesn't have a lot of users yet. Maybe there's only a couple developers on it, so they can move really quickly. So they get that into production, and they feel really good about themselves.
Yeah.
And they say, oh, this is fine. They don't have any users, right? Maybe they have like 10 and they're all internal.
Sure.
So they're not really learning the hard lessons.
The scale lesson.
Right, so they say, okay, we've got this in Kubernetes, it's working great.
Yep.
You know, they do a demo. The bosses love it, but then when they start moving in the more complex workloads, the historical workloads, the ones that have thousands of users and, you know, tens of developers, that's going to be much harder. And they're going to learn that a lot of the configuration decisions they made, a lot of the workflow decisions they made with that proof of concept don't work. And now you're in production and you have to change everything, right?
Sure.
And so there's what I call the crisis of complexity. Is when you start adding the hard things in and realize that you made a lot of bad decisions that you have to reverse.
Right.
And I think that really is due to the way that this field works, that we move fast, that we try things, that we get things out there quickly, and then unfortunately we learn lessons the hard way. Right?
and the lessons are, I mean, give an example of what it looks like to learn a lesson. Is it just a page? The website's down?
I mean, the worst lessons that you can learn are security-based lessons, right?
Sure. Okay.
Getting the Kubernetes dashboard hacked, it's a pretty bad lesson.
Yeah.
having, potentially some parts of your infrastructure, hosted on one of the cloud providers that goes down or that you don't have control over. You could have applications that aren't well architected for Kubernetes.
Yeah.
And so their failure conditions actually are just worsened by Kubernetes. If you have an app, like an old Rails app that has some database latency and your app doesn't respond to its liveness checks,
Yep.
right? You're going to get Kubernetes just restarting them in the loop. And there's all kinds of lessons, right? And Fairwinds has been doing this for 3.5 years now with Kubernetes, and we've learned all those lessons the hard way in production,
Yeah.
right? And you can just build a whole portfolio of them. So, it is one of the best ways to learn, but it's maybe not the most ideal.
Yeah, I imagine you could even put data in the wrong place and lose a massive amount of data.
Yeah.
Security is scary, data loss is scary, users leaving because you did it wrong is scary. Yeah, there's a lot of ways to mess up with complexity. So another thing I want to ask is, related to all this complexity, what happens to an organization when somebody comes in, sets all this up, finally understands all of this, gets a company to a good place, and then takes vacation or worse, quits?
Yeah, that's actually fairly common, I would say, in this particular niche of tech. And it has to do with a couple different things. One is just the nature of operations. Kubernetes is complex, and it is dealing with very important technology for companies whose business depends on it. And so the people managing that technology are constantly under stress. Not only are they managing something that's complex and hard to learn, and they've spent a lot of time learning it and becoming experts, they're asked to really carry a heavy load of making sure that it stays up to date, stays well configured, and all that kind of goodness. And so those people become pretty stressed out and often will kind of leave for greener pastures when things get tough. And so I think it's common for us to see companies going through that journey of the person who did the proof of concept and the person who got them into production and learned all the knowledge. And maybe there's one or two. At bigger companies you'll see more who spread the knowledge out, but very common for small, medium-sized companies to have one or two, and eventually they'll just take off because it's just too much. There's a lot of burnout, I would say.
Or they get recruited away because now they have this really unusual skill.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Kubernetes expertise is extremely valuable right now.
Yeah.
I don't know much about economics, but there's a bubble that's growing, I feel like. People who are good at Kubernetes operations and even application deployments and things like that are very desirable and cost a lot of money. And so bigger companies can, steal them away from the market. A lot of smaller companies have to build them from within. And if you invest all that money and time in people, and then they take off because you've burnt them out, it's pretty tough.
Yeah.
And then you're left with a system that, somebody will have to come in and relearn, and often will change when you're kind of not starting over necessarily, but almost.
Yeah. Starting a lot of it over. Okay, so then let's go back to a little bit more of the kinds of organizations that adopt it and when in their journey they adopt Kubernetes. Just talk about some of that, the who and when and why and who's making these decisions. Is it CTOs? Is it a developer at the bottom that's saying, hey, you know what, I'd really like to, or a software developer that's like, hey, I'd really like to have service ownership so I can tell when my stuff goes down?
It's a great question. I think it can come from either side, either end of the spectrum. Often the ones that come from the top down have more challenges because it's a decision maker who
read something in
read a
Gartner.
blog post, right? Read that it's up and coming, and that's not always the case. Sometimes they see the strategic value, which is great.
Sure.
But often they don't know if their organization has the technical capability and what has a strategy to adopt it. Right? And so that has to kind of come down through a lot of different layers to be able to put together a good strategy going forward.
Sure.
I think the other way is often more successful in the way that you can actually get it done, right? If a developer or an operations person is like, hey, let's just try this out, right? Because like I said, they can iterate quickly, get that proof of concept, get some production, and kind of move up that way. It's easier. It's almost as if it's easier to ask for forgiveness, right?
Sure.
Because I guess the plan is you don't need forgiveness when you've got Kubernetes making everything better. But yeah,
if it makes everything better.
Pour a little Kubernetes on it.
Does it always make everything better? Talk about times where it's a disaster.
Yeah, I think there's a famous meme, right, in the Kubernetes community where there's a big flatbed truck with a tiny little box on it, and I shipped my blog on Kubernetes.
Shipped my WordPress blog on Kubernetes, yeah.
And like, it's not necessary. It's not a problem.
Right.
Kubernetes can do anything good, but it's not necessary. And there's a lot of workloads actually now that are better suited to serverless.
Yeah.
If you're going to go in containers already and you're doing kind of event-based workflows,
Yep.
you don't need to do it in Kubernetes. I think people like single pane of glass type things, right?
Sure.
So if I have serverless type workloads and regular, I might as well shove it all in Kubernetes.
So what are the kinds of workloads that people should have when Kubernetes makes sense rather than, Google App Engine?
Yeah, I mean, I think highly scalable web apps make a lot of sense. And
Single services, microservices? I mean, can you run a gigantic monolith? Should you run a gigantic monolith?
I think that comes down to kind of the resiliency of the application and the flexibility in a container, right? It's hard to run a monolith in a container. A lot of people will shoehorn, like Fusion Passenger into a container, which is not ideal. You kind of want to make sure you can scale out and you can have them disappear without it causing any problems, is that you want each entity to kind of be light and agile and replaceable, right, and resilient. And so I think that's not super well suited to those old monolithic apps. You can do it. You'll have some pain. I think it becomes very challenging to deal with resource management and scaling if you've got apps like that. So microservices are usually best. We see that there's a lot of people that have worker loads, where you're running, a new container, a new pod for certain processes. If you want to compile some code or whatever it is, those work fairly well. Again, it's hard to get scaling right, but it's doable.
Do you ever look back at a previous job and think, man, if we'd only had Kubernetes back then?
I don't personally look back. I don't like to look back now.
I just don't look back. That's why. Oh, okay.
No, I think workloads have changed in the past several years to reflect the changes in orchestration and infrastructure capabilities, right? So if I look back at old jobs, they were probably more well suited to EC2 or GCP. Only now, because people are realizing what you need to do to play in the container space, I think that the workloads are better suited there.
And where do you see this going? Like, what's coming next, and what's got you excited about the future in this technology space? Anything that you're genuinely looking forward to, or is it all just scary and messy and see as it comes along?
Yeah, well, so I mean, the great thing again about Kubernetes is that the community just kind of picked everything up and ran with it, right? My grammar's not so great, but they're running with the ball. And the great thing about that is, you can see this with the cloud providers, with EKS and AKS and GKE. They're solving problems up to a certain level, right? And they keep pushing that level up and up. And so they're solving kind of all the boring, well-defined problems such that, companies can then just work on that top layer. And I think that's really interesting because it removes the toil from people who don't want to worry about the underlying systems necessarily.
You don't care how it's bootstrapped, you just want it bootstrapped.
Exactly. It becomes boring enough that they don't have to worry about it. Somebody else is taking care of it for them so that they can focus on the hard problems. And I'm excited about that because I can't tell you how boring it is to build a cluster these days, right? And how many you have to do, and you're doing it the same because you've developed a method is just not necessary. So I'm excited about just kind of pushing that wave forward.
Yeah. So you're excited about increasing abstraction?
Yeah.
Okay. Because it makes life easier for engineers.
It makes life easier, but also it allows you to really focus on solving the interesting problems, right? Which is, how do I get my workload to do amazing things? How do I build a product to do something that nobody's ever done before? How can I let my infrastructure folks sleep at night because there's nothing to worry about, right? As a people manager, that's really important to me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've argued that we reach a certain layer of making this complexity easy, where now it's easy enough, we can go create new complexity.
Sure.
And you describe it as solving really interesting problems.
Right.
But
let's get some complexity. Well, I mean, that's kind of the old generation of technology, right? It's maybe virtual machines, and probably all the while they were probably pretty rough in the beginning, and people were solving those problems, and eventually they became pretty easy. to build virtual machines and deploy them. Now containers is kind of new, and we're, again, developing that, pushing that forward. Whatever's next, right, is going to start after that. And I don't know if it exists yet or not. I'm not convinced it's going to be serverless.
Yeah.
But that's my uninformed opinion.
Those are the best kinds of opinions. Yeah. Okay, well, so let me ask you 2 questions as we wrap up here. I'm a CIO or CTO of a medium to large organization, and I've decided Kubernetes is the thing that I want to do. Where do I get started? Where do I point my people for resources? Where do I even find out if my workloads will work on it? What kinds of things do we need to tackle first before we can even think about Kubernetes? Where do I get started?
And I think the first place you want to get started is inspecting your workloads. I'm convinced that that's the first place to start. Your developers and your build and deploy engineers, the folks who really understand what you're trying to do, need to understand what Kubernetes has to offer, need to understand how things can be well executed and architected in Kubernetes so that they can tell you whether or not it's possible, right? If you sidestep that, you're going to be in for a world of hurt because you'll get to Kubernetes and realize you can't run your workloads.
Right.
It may mean that you have to rewrite all of your applications. It may mean that you need to, tweak them to be microservices or to be 12-factor, whatever it is. That's where I would start. That's a boring start for people, right? Because it doesn't get rewards, right? You don't see Kubernetes being built, you don't deploy anything to it.
Sure.
But I think it's really important. If you can come to the table with a Kubernetes strategy, you're going to be much better off than if you just kind of throw something over the wall and say, I need Kubernetes.
And then if I'm Jane engineer and I want to dip my toe into Kubernetes, but I've never done it before, where do I go to get started?
There are a ton of good resources online, just 101 level material.
Do you have a favorite?
I teach 101s. Or I used to anyway. No, there's YouTube videos out there. I think those are the most useful for me, just the way I learn. There's some courses now. If you go to any big conference, there's going to be a workshop where you can learn Kubernetes. I would say you can get your hands dirty pretty quickly with GKE or any of the cloud provider managed Kubernetes, just because you can get one up and running really quickly and then play with it and tweak it, and there's all kinds of example workloads out there.
And playing with it's a good place to start, probably. Start to figure out what kinds of things work and don't.
Right, and I think you kind of have to then make it familiar to you. So if you're the type of person who's looking into Kubernetes, you probably have some understanding of a workload that's familiar to you that you're deploying to some other kind of infrastructure now. And if you can start applying that to Kubernetes and start exploring how your services and apps interplay with it, I think it really kind of brings that lesson home. Unfortunately, example workloads won't always connect with you as much, right? You can get a WordPress example page up, but it doesn't mean anything to you, right? So I think the next step is really kind of making it familiar and bringing it home. Yeah.
Well, good. Well, anything I'm not asking?
You always ask me that question, and I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. Well, so then, as a last question, you also do woodworking.
I do.
How does woodworking relate to Kubernetes?
It's all about engineering.
Solving it before you get started? What does that mean?
Oh, man.
I'm totally springing this on you, so you can tell me it doesn't
The way I go about any project, and I can't call myself a woodworker. I build things with wood, or I carve things out of wood. Fine woodworkers are very picky about this. However, I think it's all kind of a similar problem, which is you really have to study the idea of what you're trying to do, right? So when I go, look for a project to build, I will watch a million YouTube videos about somebody else doing it. I'll look at every aspect of it, think through in my head how it was put together, why they did it that way, maybe take a look at a couple options of different ways they've done it, right? And then eventually when I get ready to build, I already have a plan in my mind, and I've figured out how I want to put it together such that it will be successful, right? That's the hope. And I think Kubernetes is the same way.
Yeah.
You really just have to kind of inspect the problem space and have a plan going in.
But you already have experience in it, so then when you watch the YouTube videos, you have some idea of what they're talking about, so then you know how to go about it, whereas if I went and found a random person and said, can you carve me, an intricate eagle out of this tree stump? Everybody's
a beginner sometime, right? I don't want people to be afraid of being a beginner. This goes back to what we said in the beginning, which is there's a lot of shame about being a beginner.
Sure.
It's fine. We're all just making this up as we go, right? And then the more you do it, the more you'll learn, and then eventually you will be an expert. And then you can make YouTube videos.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. We talked about a lot. When an organization should adopt Kubernetes, what kinds of organizations are doing it, what kinds of things they're going to run into along the way, and heard a few amusing anecdotes about things gone wrong or could go wrong, and even wood carving. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.